This, to me, is one of the most disturbing elements of this story. On multiple occasions in 2012, I spearheaded letters from Republican senators to the then IRS Commissioner Schulman, asking questions about the IRS's processing of applicants for tax-exempt status and the reports that the process had become politicized. I received 2 separate responses from Acting Commissioner Stephen Miller, who was at that time serving as the Deputy Commissioner for Services and Enforcement. Neither of these responses even hinted at the possibility that the targeting was going on, even though these officials in Washington were certainly aware that a number of conservative groups had in fact been targeted. Indeed, despite multiple efforts during the 2012 election campaign to find out the facts about this targeting program, the IRS did not decide to come clean until the release of the Teague report was imminent and their hand was forced. And even then, one of the top IRS officials, in consultation with the Department of Treasury, chose to disclose that it had targeted innocent organizations by responding to a planted question at a press conference. A planted question. The American people deserve to know the truth about what went on here, and they deserve to know why the truth was kept from them for so long. Were the top IRS officials willfully blind to what was going on, or were they simply holding out until after the election? While the targeting of conservative groups in the review process has received most of the attention thus far, it's not the only problem that needs to be addressed. I am, of course, referring to the fact that in 2012, one of the IRS offices that were targeting conservative groups' applications also improperly disclosed confidential information about some of the same groups to a left-leaning media organization called ProPublica. This revelation comes on the heels of other allegations that the IRS disclosed to activist groups and media outlets confidential information, including donor information, submitted by conservative nonprofits. We need to look closely at all these allegations as well. So as you can see, Mr. Chairman, there are a lot of problems at the IRS. I'm glad that, thus far, members of both parties have recognized the need to address these issues. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to be working with you on this investigation, and I hope that we'll continue to work together on a bipartisan basis to get to the bottom of all this. I want to assure our colleagues and the American people that we're going to find out exactly what happened here, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. The only way to fully address these issues and to restore the credibility of the IRS is to have a full accounting of the facts. And one way or another, we're going to learn the facts about what went on here. I hope that we can do so with the full and complete cooperation of the Obama administration. Today's hearing is just the first step in this process. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hatch. I'd now like to welcome our panel of witnesses. First, the Honorable Russell George, Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration at the United States Department of Treasury. Second, Mr. Stephen Miller, Acting Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service here in Washington, D.C. And third, former Commissioner of the IRS, the Honorable Douglas Schulman. Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I'd like you all to stand so I can swear you in, please. Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. You may be seated. As is our regular practice, we'll include your prepared statements for the record and ask each of you to summarize them in about 5 minutes. We'll start with you, Mr. George. And then after that, obviously, the committee will have a lot of questions. Mr. George.
Thank you, Chairman Bachus. Chairman Bachus, Ranking Member Hatch, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our report concerning the Internal Revenue Service's treatment of groups that apply for tax-exempt status. Our audit was initiated based on concerns expressed that certain groups were being subjected to unfair treatment by the IRS. The report issued last week addresses 3 allegations. 1, that the IRS targeted specific groups applying for tax-exempt status. 2, that the IRS delayed the processing of these groups' applications. And 3, that the IRS requested unnecessary information from the groups it subjected to special scrutiny. Our review confirmed all of the allegations. Inappropriate criteria were used by the IRS to target for review Tea Party and other organizations based on their names and policy positions. The practice started in 2010 and continued to evolve until June 2011. The criteria which we obtained from a briefing held by the IRS's exempt organizations function in June of 2011 were the organization's names, including Tea Party, Patriots, or 912 Project, whether the organizations had policy positions involving government spending, government debt, or taxes. Third, did the organizations intend to provide education to the public by advocacy or lobbying to make America a quote-unquote better place to live? And lastly, were there statements in the case file criticizing how the country is being run? These criteria were inappropriate in that they did not focus on tax-exempt laws and Treasury regulations. For example, 501c3 organizations may not engage in political campaign intervention, which is defined as action taken on behalf of or against a particular candidate running for office. 501c4 organizations may engage in such activities so long as it is not their primary activity. IRS employees began selecting Tea Party and other organizations for review in early 2010. From May 2010 through May of 2012, a team of IRS specialists in Cincinnati, Ohio, referred to as the Determinations Unit, selected 298 cases for additional scrutiny. We found that the first time executives from Washington, D.C. became aware of the use of these criteria was June 2011, with some executives not becoming aware of the criteria until April or May 2012. These inappropriate criteria remained in effect for approximately 18 months. After learning of the criteria, the Director of Exempt Organizations changed them in July of 2011 to remove references to organization names and policy positions, only to have staff in Cincinnati change the criteria back again to target organizations with specific policy positions. The difference this time is that they did not include Tea Party or other named organizations. It took until May 2012 that the criteria were finally changed to be consistent with laws and regulations. The organizations selected for review for significant political campaign intervention experienced substantial delays in the processing of their applications. As of December 2012, the status for the 296 cases that we were able to review was 108 cases had been approved, 28 cases were withdrawn, and 160 cases were still open. It is noteworthy that 0 cases had been denied. Of the cases still open, some have been in process for over 3 years and crossed 2 election cycles without resolution. Of the 108 cases approved, 31 were Tea Party, 912, or Patriot organizations. Another troubling aspect we uncovered was the fact that the IRS requested unnecessary information for many political cases. 98 of 170 cases that received follow-up requests for information from the IRS had unnecessary questions. We found that staff at the Determinations Unit sent letters requesting this information with little or no supervisory review. The IRS later determined these questions were unneeded, but not until after media accounts and questions by members of Congress arose in March of 2012. An example of unnecessary information requested was the names of past and future donors. The IRS informed us that they subsequently destroyed the donor information received from applicants. In closing, the IRS demonstrated gross mismanagement in its operation of this program. The allegations were substantiated and raised troubling questions about whether the IRS has effective management, oversight, and control, at least in the exempt organizations function. Chairman Bachus, Ranking Member Hatch, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to present the findings of our audit.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mr. Miller, you're next.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Unfortunately, given time considerations, the IRS was unable to prepare written testimony. I would note that I have a very brief statement before I take questions. First and foremost, as acting commissioner, I want to apologize on behalf of the Internal Revenue Service for the mistakes that we made and the poor service we provided. The affected organizations and the American public deserve better. Partisanship, or even the perception of partisanship, has no place at the IRS. It cannot even appear to be a consideration in determining the tax exemption of an organization. I do not believe that partisanship motivated the people who engaged in the practices described in the Treasury Inspector General's report. I've reviewed the Treasury Inspector General's report, and I believe its conclusions are consistent with that. I think that what happened here was that foolish mistakes were made by people trying to be more efficient in their workload selection. The listing described in the report, while intolerable, was a mistake and not an act of partisanship. The agency is moving forward. It has learned its lesson. We have previously worked to correct issues in the processing of the cases described in the report and have implemented changes to make sure that this type of thing never happens again. Now that Teague has completed its fact-finding and issued its report, management will take appropriate action with respect to those responsible. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Schulman.
Chairman Bachus.
You might pull the microphone a little closer to you so we all hear. And make sure it's on, too. That helps.
Chairman Bachus, Ranking Member Hatch, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee to talk about the Inspector General's report. I was Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service from March 2008 till November 2012. During that time, the agency was called upon to tackle a number of challenges. The agency played a key role in stimulus and recovery efforts during the economic downturn, aggressively addressed offshore tax evasion, and completed a major modernization of its core technology database. The agency also continued to deliver on its core mission of collecting the revenue to fund the government. The IRS is a major operation with more than 90,000 employees who work on issues ranging from processing individual tax returns to building complex technology to ensuring compliance with businesses to educating the public about tax law changes to administering a very complex set of rules governing tax-exempt organizations. I have recently read the Treasury Inspector General's report. I was dismayed and I was saddened to read the Inspector General's conclusions that actions had been taken creating the appearance that the service was not acting as it should have. That is, as a non-political, non-partisan agency. The IRS serves a critical function for our nation. It collects the taxes necessary to run the government. Because of this important responsibility, the IRS must administer, and it must be perceived to administer, our tax laws fairly and impartially. Given the challenges that the agency faces, it does its job in an admirable way the great majority of the time. And the men and women of the IRS are hardworking, honest public servants. While the Inspector General's report did not indicate that there was any political motivation involved, the actions outlined in the report have justifiably led to questions about the fairness of the approach taken here. The effect has been bad for the agency and bad for the American taxpayer. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you all, three of you. I have a couple of questions. First, Mr. Miller and Mr. Schulman. Essentially, it's my understanding that the IRS headquarters shut down the use of political terms such as Tea Party and other terms we've all learned about in June of 2011. That's when headquarters shut that down. Why weren't people then fired or transferred? More significant action taken than just told, don't do this, given how outrageous this conduct is. Why wasn't more definitive action taken?
It's on. Sorry. I don't believe that I was aware at the time that had happened. I first became aware of this in May of 2012.
Schulman, you were around during this time.
Yeah, in June of 2011, I don't believe I was aware of this, actually.
Well, who was aware? Somebody at headquarters was aware, obviously, but besides Lois Lerner.
Well, the report indicates that exempt organizations knew. There's no indication, I think, from the report, and you'd have to ask the Inspector General that others knew at this time.
Well, sorry, well, you're acting, head of the IRS, we're the head of IRS, been showing me, well, who did know? I mean, come on, you've read the report. You were acting commissioner, you were commissioner. Come on. If you don't know, it sounds like somebody's not doing his job. So why wasn't more direct action taken? First, when these terms were discovered right away, and then had a second chance. IRS had a second chance after the same activity started again in January 2012. Incredibly, started again. IRS stopped for a while, then went back again. Old habits. I can't believe that, frankly. Why wasn't more firm action taken by people, either the commissioner himself or by people at the top? This is outrageous. Any person can figure out that this is unacceptable conduct. Mr. Miller?
Again, sir, all I can say is we were unaware. I was unaware, I believe, at the time that it had happened. When I found out in May, I took action.
But what action did you take?
So I was briefed on, after sending a group to take a look at the cases in May, they reported back to me in May of 2012, essentially which much of what had transpired and what is shown in the IG report, that the cases were languishing, that a list had been utilized, that letters had gone out that were much more broad than they should be. At that point, we had already taken care of the letters because those had come up, and this is how we knew something was going on, and I asked for a review. We then trained our folks. We held workshops to ensure that they were going to do the work well. We took a look at the cases. I asked for the cases to be looked at and grouped in a fashion that those that looked like they should be approved were approved. Those that looked like they needed some work got that work, and those that needed further development got that development. So we took action on that. I also, at that time, I was aware that TIGDA was working on this, but I took some intermediate action pending TIGDA. We transferred and reassigned an individual who had been involved in the letters, and I asked that the person who I believed at the time was responsible for the listing, that oral counseling occur. At that time, the listing process had.
All right, I appreciate that, and this committee has sent many questions to you and Mr. Schulman and others to try to get the answer to some of these questions, and we're not going to get the definitive answers at this moment. That's clear. A deeper question to me is, how did this culture, what created this culture of indifference to the American people and of such aggressive behavior, so improperly targeting certain groups? What caused that culture to develop? And what did you do about correcting that culture, if even we're aware of it? Either one of you, Mr. Miller or Mr. Schulman. I'll start with you, Mr. Schulman.
Sure. During my time at the IRS, I believed and I articulated that the IRS needed to be a non-political, non-partisan
We may have articulated
agency.
that, but how did this happen?
I think that there's a set of rules built in to the system. There's laws, there's education of people that I think the vast majority of the IRS employees understand that and
What
abide
happened in
with that.
Cincinnati? What conditions caused that? Because my time's expiring here. It already has expired, frankly. If you could just very quickly, in a nutshell, bottom line, how did this happen?
Mr. Chairman, I can't say that I know that answer.
Well, you're a commissioner.
I'm 6 months out of.
You got some sense of the outfit. You're a commissioner for a good number of years. You got some idea. You've thought about this.
I'm 6 months out of office. When I left, the IG was looking into this to gather all of the facts. I've now had the benefit of reading the report. And that's, the full accounting of facts that I have at this point. And so I don't think I can answer that question.
Well, I'm kind of
Mr.
disappointed,
Chairman.
frankly, because you've had time to think about this, and you certainly have more thoughts than that. Senator Hatch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On two different occasions, my colleagues and I wrote letters to you, Mr. Schulman. In the first letter on March 14, 2012, we asked about selective enforcement by the IRS and requests for donor information. Then we wrote again on June 18, 2012, to request more information about the IRS's practice of requesting confidential donor information. As I wrote in my March 2012 letter, quote, "It is critical that the public have confidence that federal tax compliance efforts are pursued in a fair, even-handed, and transparent manner without regard to politics of any kind," unquote. The responses that I received from the IRS were anything but transparent. The IRS responded to these two letters on April 26, 2012 and September 11, 2012, and both of these responses were signed by you, Mr. Miller. These responses did not disclose that the IRS had any reason to believe that it had improperly targeted Tea Party or other conservative organizations, or improperly asked for confidential donor lists. I ask unanimous consent to put all four letters in the record at this point.
The objection.
Recently, we have learned that the IRS was in fact aware that the IRS had targeted Tea Party and other conservative organizations. We know that by June 2011, at the latest, Lois Lerner, the director of the Exempt Organizations Group in D.C., was aware that IRS examiners had issued a, quote, "be on the lookout," unquote, listing regarding Tea Party and other organizations. We also know that on May 30th, 2012, Teague briefed you, Mr. Schulman, about its ongoing audit of these practices. Yet when you testified before Congress on March 22nd, 2012, you said, quote, "there was absolutely no targeting," unquote. To this day, you have not corrected your testimony, even though you know that the IRS was inappropriately screening Tea Party organizations. Now, Mr. Schulman, why have you not come forward before today to correct the record and acknowledge that there was, in fact, inappropriate screening occurring in the IRS, the organization that you headed?
Let me answer a few things. One is the full set of facts around these circumstances came out last week in the Teague report, which I read. Until that point, I did not have a full set of facts about.
Yeah, but you knew this was going on. Why didn't you let us know when that's what we were inquiring about when we sent these letters to you?
What I knew was not the full set of facts in this report. What I knew sometime in the spring of 2012 was that there was a list, it was being used. Knew that the word Tea Party was on the list. Didn't know what other words were on the list. Didn't know the scope and severity of this. Didn't know if groups that were pulled in were groups that would have been pulled in anyway.
But you knew
and I
this
took what I thought at the time, and I think now, was the proper step when a concern is brought to the Commissioner of Internal Revenue Service, which is to make sure that the matter is being looked at by the Inspector General.
But we sent you letters inquiring about this with a number of senators on those letters. And you should have corrected the record. And you should have done it long before today. And that's the point I'm making. Mr. Miller, your signature's on both of the responses that I received from the IRS. Nowhere in your responses did you indicate that you knew the IRS was improperly selecting Tea Party organizations for extra scrutiny. Nowhere in your responses did you indicate that you knew the IRS was asking improper questions about donor contributions. You just sat on that guilty knowledge. Mr. George stated that he briefed you on May 3rd, 2012 about Teague's audit, so we know you were aware of it at the time that you responded to my second letter, if not both letters. But you didn't mention any of this in your responses to me, to the Senate, or to any other congressional body. Now, Mr. Miller, that's a lie by omission. There's no question about that in my mind. It's a lie by omission. And you kept it from people who have the obligation to oversee this matter. On Friday, you swore under oath that you had told the truth in your prior responses. You said that the IRS had been guilty of, quote, horrible customer service, unquote. Mr. Miller, what we have learned about the IRS in recent days goes far beyond horrible customer service. Why did you mislead me and my colleagues, my fellow senators, and most importantly, the American people, by failing to tell us what you knew about the exact subject we were asking about? Why didn't you tell us?
Mr. Hatch, I did not lie.
You're what?
I did not lie, sir.
You lied by
I answered
omission.
those
You
questions.
knew what was going on. You didn't, and you knew that we had asked. You should have told us.
I answered the questions. I answered them truthfully. Did I know about the list? Yes. Not on the first letter, by the way, because the timing, I wouldn't have known for that. On the second letter, we answered those questions, sir. Frankly, the concept of political motivation here, I did not agree with that in May. I do not agree with that now. We were not politically motivated in targeting conservative groups. That's borne out by Mr. George's report.
What else
The
could you
fact.
call it? He just said he hadn't found that up till now. And then today's statement was a little more definitive than the one he gave to the House. Now, let me just say this. You knew this was going on. You knew we were concerned. You knew we'd written to you. You had our letters. Why didn't you correct the record? Why didn't you let us know? We would have solved this problem a long time ago.
Teague was looking at the cases, sir. And
So
Teague was
it was
doing
Tigla's responsibility, or was it yours?
I'm sorry?
The commissioner relied on you to answer our letters. Why didn't you answer them? And why didn't you tell us this information
I
that you
believe
knew,
I
at least
did-
on the second?
I believe I did answer them, and I did answer them truthfully, sir.
My time.
Thank you, Senator Hatch. Next is, we're going down the list. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is an incredibly important hearing. And let me just say, as we heard Mr. Miller, you're saying this was a mistake. We would suggest extremely serious mistake, and Mr. George says gross mismanagement. What I don't understand is how, again, something could start in 2010. It was not until June of 2011 that the director of the exempt organizations learned of the practice. It wasn't until January of 2012, 7 months later, that they set up new criteria, which was still inappropriate after they'd been told to change it. And it wasn't until 4 months after that that the Cincinnati office finally started doing the right criteria. And so both for Mr. Schulman and Mr. Miller, it took almost 2 years for the IRS to finally fix the problem, including 11 months after it came to the attention of the division head. How in the world could it take so long for senior people at the IRS to find the problem, fix the problem, and was there no ongoing oversight of the employees in Cincinnati and what they were doing? Mr. Schulman, let me start with you.
Again, I'm not there to go ask a set of questions of people, what happened when, who, and how.
With all due respect, you were there, though.
No, I was there, but since this all came to light and the full set of facts are there, I haven't been able to be back there talking with people doing things. So let me just answer, though, your question.
But why didn't you know when you were there?
I agree that this is an issue that when someone spotted it, they should have run up the chain, and they didn't. And why they didn't, I don't know.
Mr. Miller?
So I would agree. I'm not going to disagree at all with your characterization of bad management here, because I think that did happen. And I don't want to understate concerns with the list, because we should not have done that. We simply should not have done that. We should be looking at the file. We should be looking at the facts. We should not look at names. We should not look at the positions taken on a given topic in terms of how we pull people into full development of these cases. But we were not, it was not elevated. We did not know.
Mr. George, could you speak more about the management, what your review has revealed about the IRS management? How was that breakdown possible, given the management structure? And has the IRS done anything to make the unacceptable actions like this less likely in the future?
While we have not yet completed our analysis of their response to our recommendations, we do intend to do so in the future. So, Senator, I'll be able to respond in full once we've completed that review. It is worth noting that the determinations unit in Cincinnati did seek clarification from their headquarters unit in Washington, and it took almost a year before a response was received by them to their request on how to handle some of these issues. And the bottom line, Senator, it was just, again, a breakdown in communications, a mismanagement on the part of the Internal Revenue Service.
It does sound, though, that the first clarification they received, they took that back and then they changed again and did something inappropriately.
Well, there were two aspects of it. They sought clarification initially, had not received an answer, eventually did get direction from Ms. Lerner to change the way they were acting, and then on their own decided to revert to a different, slightly different, yet still inappropriate way of handling these matters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Grassley.
I'm going to direct my question, or at least the first one, to Mr. Schulman, Mr. Miller. Now, this comes directly from Iowa. One of my constituents attempted to establish 501c3 charity called Coalition for Life of Iowa. She told my staff that an IRS agent told her, quote, "Your application's ready to go. However, it will not be approved until you send a letter signed by your entire board under penalty of perjury saying that you will not protest at Planned Parenthood." End of quote. Now, that's outrageous that that statement would be even made by anybody in government, that somehow you got to compromise your First Amendment rights. She also received a letter from the IRS asking several invasive questions, including the details of the group's prayer meeting. Now, stop to think about the government getting involved in somebody having a prayer meeting. It appears that the IRS essentially offered this group a quid pro quo. You can become a charity if you don't protest in front of a Planned Parenthood. Generally speaking, so you don't have to worry about 6103, is it appropriate even for an IRS employee to offer a quid pro quo in the example like this? Mr. Miller or Mr. Schulman, either one of you.
The answer is no. I mean, we shouldn't be trading.
Okay, then let's move on. That's a good answer, because that's the answer you ought to give. But how on earth could you let something like this happen under your leadership, and do either of you feel any responsibility or remorse for treating an American citizen this way?
I think I started my public statement with an apology, sir, and I would continue that. I don't know what happened in your given case, and as you well are aware, I can't speak to it under the 6103 rules, but I do apologize for the treatment of folks. And look, there are two things that happened with these cases. First was the selection, and the selection criteria was bad. Second was their treatment once they were in that group, and that too was bad, sir. It was. I don't know whether this particular organization was inside or outside of that group, but the service that folks got was not the service that we should be providing anyone. There's no question about that.
Mr. Miller, on May the 14th, I wrote you a letter raising questions about the so-called spontaneous apology Lois Lerner made at the American Bar Association May the 10th. Initially, Ms. Lerner said her response was spontaneous and denied that the question was planted. However, you admitted during your testimony last week that the IRS had, in fact, planted the question to be asked at the ABA conference. You said, quote, "It was a prepared Q&A," end of quote. Whose idea was it to create this prepared Q&A, and why?
Well, I will take responsibility for that. The thought was to, now that we had the Teague report, we had all the facts, we had our response, we thought we should begin talking about this. We thought we'd get out an apology. The way we did it, we wanted to reach out to Hill staff about the same time and come out brief. Did not work out. obviously the entire thing was an incredibly bad idea.
Has the IRS ever used a prepared Q&A in the past? And if so, give us some examples, if it's been done before.
Apologize, I'd have to think about it, sir. Nothing comes to mind, though.
Okay. How is it appropriate for the federal government employees to secretly plant questions or release information in advance of an IG report?
I think that what we tried to do was get the apology out, sir, and start the story. The report was coming. We knew that. And the report was done.
Mr. Miller, on May the 8th this year, Ways and Means Subcommittee hearing, Representative Crowley asked Lois Lerner if she could, quote, comment briefly on the status of the IRS investigations into these nonprofits, end of quote. Ms. Lerner pointed to Congressman Crowley to a questionnaire on the IRS website. She said nothing about Teague's pending report or the disclosure she made just 2 days later about political targeting. As a result, I think very understandably, Representative Crowley has said that he feels misled and has called for Ms. Lerner to resign. Do you agree with Representative Crowley that Ms. Lerner gave misleading testimony to Congress?
I don't have any knowledge one way or another on that, sir. I've not watched that.
Has the IRS proposed to discipline Ms. Lerner at all for all or any part she played in the underlying events or testimony before Congress?
At this point, now that the Teague report is out, now that all this is coming to light, those discussions are ongoing, and I will not be part of those discussions, obviously, but those discussions will occur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Nelson, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take a different tack. I'd like to go back how we got into this mess in the first place. And the statute, of course, says these organizations, C4, the net earnings of which are devoted exclusively to charitable, educational, or recreational purposes. And then the rule that came along fleshing out the statute talks about promotion of the social welfare. An organization is operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. And then it further defines that term. The promotion of social welfare does not include direct or indirect participation or intervention in political campaigns. So I want to get back to the original purpose of the statute as being implemented by the IRS. How could you all in the IRS allow the tax breaks funded basically by the taxpayer on these political campaign expenditures? Can you all shed some light, please?
Well, I can start, sir. So there's let me try to restate some pieces of the questions you may be asking and see if I'm getting them right, and please correct me if I'm not. There's a question out there that the statute, and I believe the chair references, the statute talks about exclusively for social welfare. The regulation, which was promulgated 50-some years ago, talks about primarily.
It uses primarily, but then it goes on to say what is promotion of social welfare. This is the rule. Does not include direct or indirect participation or intervention in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. And yet what we've seen in the course of the last two campaign cycles is enormous money running through both through these C4 organizations, which the avowed purpose is on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office and the intervention in political campaigns. So where is the IRS in the regulatory process enforcing its rule to stop this in the first place, which if it had, would have gotten to the mess that we're in right now?
So there's a couple of places where we have to act. And again, I mean, let me, if I can set the context a little bit. As a 501c4 organization, you are permitted to engage in an amount of political campaign activity. You are. As long as it is not, along with the other things that are not social welfare, your primary activity. We have an obligation to take a look at cases, both in the audit stream, we're out there doing this sort of work, or in the determination letter process, which is why we began to centralize these cases. You asked for the genesis of this. Centralization here was warranted. We have to look, we're obligated under the law to look at what an organization does in order to grant exemption. The way we centralized was wrong, and that goes to the listing that we used. But we are to look at the amount of political campaign activity that is planned and how an organization operates as we do our work, and that is what happened in the determination letter process here.
Okay, well, I would simply say, Mr. Chairman, since we are doing the oversight here, that the rule, I understand the King's English, and it says the promotion of social welfare does not include direct or indirect participation or intervention in political campaigns. Now, how you interpret that to say that that does allow some intervention in political campaigns is beyond me. And if that had been cut off at the pass, we wouldn't even be getting to these interpretations. Yes, sir.
Senator, I just would like to note that Teague will be conducting a review of the IRS's oversight of the level of campaign intervention by 501c4s shortly.
Who will be doing that?
My organization, sir, Teague, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration.
Well, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I'd say that if we could get the IRS to follow the law and the regulation that implemented it, we wouldn't have this problem in the future.
Well, Senator, I think I agree with you, but I also think it's very complicated. And it's unfortunate this issue has not been addressed in the last couple of years with any precision, any focus, any straight thinking. And we're going to have to we have to enact some changes in the statute, and also our IRS has to, I think, do a better job following the statute. My personal view is this confusion, this ambiguity has led to part of the problem here. And that IRS,
I certainly agree with you.
And we're going to have to straighten it out. Next, I have Senator Roberts. You're next.
Thank you. Listening to the responses that both of you gentlemen have provided my colleagues on this committee, I am reminded of one of my granddaughters, age 4. When she knows she's done something wrong, she just shuts her eyes and says, "You can't see me." Well, we can all see what happened. The problem is no one is taking responsibility other than horrible consumer service and apologies. There's a Kansas saying, never lie unless you have to, and if you don't have a damn good lie, stick to the truth. Seems to me we need some real truth tellers here. And facts are stubborn things, and what we have here is targeted harassment and abuse of conservative groups. We can talk about the statute all day long, but that's what has happened. And as we hear daily from others, many who simply have contributed to the candidate of their choice or stated personal views. I think that's very significant. Nobody likes to be audited, and nobody likes to say they have been audited, especially with what has been going on. So what we have on our hands is abuse, harassment, and the suppression of the First Amendment rights, and nobody owning up to it. Now, the fact of the matter is that the IRS has been operating in a highly politicized manner for at least 3 years. 3 years ago, a top economic advisor to the White House divulged confidential tax information regarding a privately held company in order to make a political point. I asked the IG for Tax Administration for a response. We never heard back. Never heard back at all. Not late, just didn't hear back. Last year, members of this committee, as Senator Hatch has indicated, hearing a growing number of complaints, asked if individuals or groups were being singled out or targeted in the application process. Here's the letter that you sent to me and other members of the committee. It's the same letter, different names. Might want to look up, you'll see this. It's 10 pages long, single space, about 12 point. At any rate, completely silent on targeting, but full of a detailed analysis of the law. But you knew that targeting was going on. I just don't think you do that. That really befuddles me as to why anybody in a position like you or basically Mr. Schulman would ever do that, just not respond. You also said that the Determinations Office was simply trying to find a more efficient way to process a huge number of exemption applications. Here we have Cincinnati, IRS officials milling about, doing their best but falling short, foolish actions, need more money, need more lawyers. This may have been foolish, but given what I know about the IRS operates, I find it very hard to believe that the IRS employees were given free rein to set up a BOLO list, be on the lookout list, like law enforcement. There must have been a directive from Washington or something. We need full disclosure of how this has happened. There was a news report quoting an anonymous Cincinnati IRS employee. Now, they've been taking a lot of grief here. And accordingly, this quote was attributed to this anonymous IRS employee. Well, we've had all the problems with this, and we knew that it was wrong. We knew there would be hell to pay. We also knew that when it hits the fan, nobody at the top will take the blame. It'll come right down the slide right to us. Well, I'd like to at least have somebody, Lois Lerner, the lady who doesn't do math but can, plant a question, Sarah Hall Ingram, who's now going to be working for the Affordable Health Care Act office, and that's my next question if we go to another round, is how on earth we do that with 15,000 new employees trying to administer the Affordable Health Care Act with a lot of specific questions. Let's move up to Joseph Grant, who's the Deputy Tax Commissioner. We're not going to hear from him. He retired. Mr. Miller, you've apologized, and then you are leaving. Mr. Schulman, you are 6 months out, so can't remember. Mr. Wilkins, the Chief Counsel of IRS, he is not here, but he probably should be here. And then the Secretary of the Treasury, Jacob Lew. It went right up there. And then finally to Catherine Rumler, who is the White House General Counsel. Do any of these folks, and yourself included, ever say what was going on and take responsibility? I just have not seen that. My follow-up question will be in regard on how on earth can the IRS have proper oversight and management to the implement of the Affordable Health Care Act, given the current situation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Crapo, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of discussion about who knew what and when they knew it. And one of the big questions I have, this is probably for you, Mr. George, is it seems that there is an argument being made that there was no political motivation in these actions. Is that a conclusion that you have reached?
In the review that we conducted thus far, Senator, that is the conclusion that we've reached.
And how do you reach that kind of a conclusion?
In this instance, it was as a result of the interviews that were conducted of the people who were most directly involved in the overall matter. And so you take it one step by another, and we directly inquired as to whether or not there was direction from people in Washington beyond those who are directly related to the Determinations Unit. And their indications to us, now I have to note, this was not done under oath. This was, and again, an audit and not an investigation. But they did indicate to us that they did not receive direction from people beyond the IRS.
When you say people beyond the IRS, that could be anyone up the chain of the IRS?
It, in theory, could be, but we have no evidence thus far that it was beyond, again, the people in the determinations unit.
So in other words, you have simply the statements of those who were engaging in the conduct saying that they were not politically motivated.
That is correct, sir.
And based on that statements not under oath, you've reached the conclusion that there was no political motivation. Now, have you reached the conclusion that there was none or that you haven't found it?
It's the latter, that we have not found any, sir.
Because it seems to me that it's almost unbelievable to look at what's happening and then say, well, there's no political motivation here. How could an agency with the power that the Internal Revenue Service has engage in this kind of conduct and it not be politically motivated? You know, I think that most people in the United States have a very quick and intuitive understanding of the reason that these revelations are so concerning to the country. If you look at the Internal Revenue Agency and the Internal Revenue Service, more than perhaps any other agency of government, it has the capacity to be the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and the executioner in ways that can devastate individuals and families and businesses. And Americans understand that. And to have the investigation reach the conclusion that these kinds of actions were just a statistical anomaly, or that they just all sort of statistically came together at the same time, but that there was no finding of any kind of political motivation, I think is almost beyond belief. Is there any way that you can conduct further investigation and perhaps by putting people under oath, identify where the direction came from? As my colleague Senator Roberts has just indicated, we have continuous denial of responsibility for the policies. Those implementing the policies say apparently it wasn't us. And we are asked as an American people to believe that just out of the ethosphere or something, the notion to target these individuals and entities just coalesced and came together?
Senator, as a result, and this is standard practice, as a result of audits that we conduct, many times there are subsequent investigations. Suffice it to say that this matter is not over as we are concerned in terms of our next actions in this matter, Senator Kriebel.
So you believe there will be further investigation on this issue?
There will be continued review by us, and if it ultimately leads to an investigation, that may be the case.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bill from Cheyenne, Wyoming called my office and said that the administrator was fired, was not the real problem, and was just a fall guy. Now, from the testimony that we heard earlier, there was some disciplinary action taken, but the administrator didn't know about it. Doesn't disciplinary action filter up in these organizations? I got a call from Charles of Pinedale, who had concerns that the churches were being targeted as well, noting that the IRS had requested membership lists of his church. That sounds a little bit above and beyond what ought to be done. But to follow up on what Senator Grassley was saying about Mrs. Lerner's question at the American Bar Association tax section, doesn't the IRS have a policy of not commenting on issues subject to an Inspector General Tax Administration audit prior to the public release of the audit? And if so, why did the IRS feel it was so necessary to make such statements days before the report was publicly released? Why did the IRS not shed light on the issue years ago when it became aware of the inappropriate targeting and the discipline that I referred to? Mr. Miller?
First, if I could correct part of your question, sir, going back to the disciplinary action. I actually took that disciplinary action in May of 2012. Going forward, we do have a practice of not talking about investigations or audits. The audit was done at this point. We thought mistakenly that we should get in front and apologize and that was, and reach out to the Hill in advance of it coming out. And that was wrong. We made a mistake.
I'll look back at the testimony. I thought that you were not aware of the disciplinary action. At any rate, David of Casper, Wyoming, posted on Facebook that he'd like to know why the IRS shared information from Tea Party groups with the liberal media group ProPublica. Does anybody have an answer to that?
So I would recommend, and I don't know whether Mr. George can speak to this, but there were in the media discussions of the release of some data to ProPublica. A referral was made to Teague on that out of our offices, and at this point, I think Mr. George can speak to that better than I.
Okay, and to follow up a little bit on what Senator Roberts said, Mr. George, when you commented at the House and Ways and Means Committee hearing last week, you believed the actions were inappropriate but not illegal. Would you weigh in on whether you still believe that's the case, or any of the actions that were taken by the IRS employees illegal? And if not, would you please elaborate on why your audit findings do not suggest that there was any illegal activity? Because your group conducted an audit and not an investigation, is it true there could in fact have been illegal activity that your audit did not uncover?
Yes, Senator, two things. One, to address Mr. Miller's point about the matter that you mentioned, the release of taxpayer information could be a violation of Title 26, Section 6103, which does have criminal penalties associated with it. That is something that my organization investigates. We take quite seriously. And if we do find evidence of such activity, we would refer it to prosecutors for criminal prosecution. But I'm otherwise restricted by law from revealing any additional information beyond that. And as it relates to this instant matter, the Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998 certainly provides for the action to be taken if IRS employees are guilty of, again, abusing, misusing, and among a number of other things, taxpayer information. We are charged, again, with reviewing that. We're doing so, and if we determine that something has occurred, we will certainly, again, pass it on either in an administrative environment or if, and again, it seems very unlikely, a criminal environment pursuant to this act itself, RRA 98. The RRA 98 has very few, if any, criminal aspects to it, but there are quite a few administrative actions that can be taken as a result of its violation. But based on that, again, we thus far have not uncovered any actions that we would deem illegal in this instant matter, sir.
Okay, I guess the American public will kind of judge that, but it seems like it's very borderline if it's not illegal. My time's expired.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several questions for you, Mr. Schulman and Mr. Miller. And for me, the basic proposition is simple. Notwithstanding the troubling and unacceptable conduct of the IRS, if political organizations do not want to be scrutinized by the government, they shouldn't seek privileges like tax-free status and anonymity for their donors. To argue otherwise is to advantage tax cheats to the detriment of law-abiding Americans. That's why my hope is that out of this debate will come clear and enforceable rules that treat all political groups equally. So with respect to questions, Mr. Miller and Mr. Schulman, the lines have blurred between political active groups that disclose their donors, those are the 527s, and those who do not, those are the 501c4s. And it has become apparent that organizations that ought to be 527s are applying for C4 status to avoid disclosure obligations. That means there is an incentive for people to choose their tax status based on whether they want to hide their donors. My view is that's a loophole the Congress ought to close. Given that to be exempt from federal income tax, Section 501c4 of the Code requires nonprofits to operate exclusively as opposed to substantially or primarily for the promotion of social welfare. My question to the two of you, Mr. Schulman and Mr. Miller, why was this problem not corrected? Mr. Schulman.
Senator, could you just
Yeah, the line.
clarify the problem?
Yeah, the line's blurred. The lines have blurred between the 527s and the 501c4s, so there's an incentive for people to choose their tax status based on whether they want to hide their donors. I think it's real straightforward. The line's blurred, and you all don't seem to have done anything about it, and I want to know why not.
Well, look, let me state that I think the law in the tax-exempt area is very complex, like the rest of our...
Mr. Schulman, we understand all that. Why didn't you do anything on your watch to correct it?
So let me continue. The Treasury regulations that the IRS staff in Cincinnati was wrestling with in this case are longstanding regulations. I believe they're 40-plus years
50.
Old.
50.
And I did see that the Inspector General in his report recommended that Treasury ought to look at the regulations. I heard the chairman say he was going to look at this, and all I can say is that, you know, this is a very hard task given to the IRS. To have the IRS, which needs to process 140 million tax returns and get billions of dollars refunds out to people every year, to also have them have this piece of the operation that by the law has to be asking questions about political activities is very difficult. And so from where I sit as a former IRS commissioner, if Congress could help clarify the law, that would be a very helpful thing.
Mr. Miller, same question. What did you do to correct this problem on your watch?
So we have put out some guidance, but not enough. I mean, the issues are several-fold. One is we get 70,000 applications for exemption a year. The number of those that are C4s is much less, but even those have doubled over the last few years. There is no doubt that since 2010, when Citizens United sort of released this wave of cash, that some of that cash headed towards C4 organizations. That's proven out by FEC data and IRS data. That does put pressure on us to take a look. As I had mentioned earlier, 527 organizations can do all the politics they want to do. 501c4 organizations have a limited ability to do politics. When organizations choose Plan B, the 501c4 option, it's our obligation to go in and look hard at whether they meet those requirements or could be a 527 organization. But in fact, we would have to talk, and I'm sure staff will come up and work you through. There are some issues in the law now. You can't convert, or we cannot convert a 501c4 organization into a 527 organization at this point, I don't believe.
Yeah,
That's a legal issue.
What troubles me is on your watch, when the lines are blurring on this disclosure issue, as far as I can tell, you all didn't do anything to correct the problem in a meaningful way. And I think that's very regrettable. Now, let me ask about one other issue for the future going forward. The IRS and the Inspector General agree on a number of reform proposals, but the IRS does not support one of the most important, and that's developing and making public clear guidance for processing potentially political cases. Now, even the best training doesn't prepare employees to fairly apply ambiguous rules. In the absence of clear guidelines, the country is in effect left to the whims of the bureaucracy. Wouldn't it make sense to have those knowledgeable about political campaigns and campaign finance work with the IRS to develop clear and enforceable guidelines that are really at the intersection of these two areas, campaign finance and tax law? Wouldn't it make sense to get two agencies, particularly the Federal Election Commission and the IRS, working together under congressional and public oversight at this point? Either one of you. Start with you, Mr. Schulman.
Look, it sounds reasonable to me, but I don't direct what the IRS does now, so I can't speak for what the IRS should be doing at this point.
Mr. Miller?
I divide the world into two pieces. Should we do guidance? Absolutely. There's a different sort of issue that was involved in the Teague report that we ought to take a look at again anyway, and I agree on that. That was whether there's some sort of guide sheet, some sort of template that we could do to move these cases forward, I believe. And there, the concern of those involved, and I was not, is that these cases are very fact-specific. and that may not be possible. But I do think, given all of this, we ought to work with Teague and see what
My time is up, but they are fact-specific, but the Inspector General is right. We can get more expertise if we start bringing in people who are knowledgeable about election law. This was another failure, in my view, in terms of what the problems are that we're dealing with now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. I might say, though, in response to the question asked by Senator Wyden about why didn't you do something when you're on notice, frankly, I did. I'm sure Senator Wyden is not comfortable with your answer. I certainly am not, because I wrote a letter to you, Mr. Schulman, September 28, 2010, asking you to look into this very question that Senator Wyden is raising. Clearly, a Mack truck is being driven through the 501c4 loophole for the reasons that have been discussed here. And I must say, the answer we got back from you, what's the date, February, many months later, basically says, yeah, we share your concern, but kind of looking at it. That's all it says. You know, you were on notice, and you did acknowledge that you're on notice, but nobody did anything about it, and I'm just quite disappointed. Next, Senator Melendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I join you in your opening statement. The idea that any government agency would use searches of politically charged terms to single out groups for selective review is truly offensive to our concept of democracy. And I believe it's not only unacceptable, but it's pretty appalling. And it undermines the very nature of a government and its people that consent by virtue of believing that its institutions will work in a way that are fair and transparent. Having said that, I also have real concerns, and I want to follow up on, I think there are two scandals here. One is the management failures and the whole process of singling out specific groups. The other is how we take statutory authority and then extrapolate it differently than what the Congress meant. I read the statute with reference to 501c4s, and it says civil leagues or organizations not organized for profit, but operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. The IRS took that statute, the congressional vote, to say exclusively, and turned it an organization is operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare if it is primarily engaged in promoting some way the common good and general welfare. I didn't see a vote for primarily. I saw a vote for exclusively, because we wanted to limit the scope of who could avail themselves of the benefit of a 501c4 under the tax code. So do you believe, I'd like to ask the Inspector General, do you believe that a more literal reading of the statutory language could have taken some of the authority of the subjective scrutiny out of the hands of the IRS officials, thus avoiding or mitigating some of the problems that we're talking about here today?
Senator, I will respond directly to your question, but I just have to acknowledge that the Secretary of the Treasury has delegated all tax policy questions exclusively to the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. And with that said, the direct issue you raised with me was beyond the scope of this audit. But that said, it would seem as if what you're saying would be accurate, that, you know, that they should have not necessarily taken the interpretation that they did, but I will have to leave it.
Mr. Miller, Mr. Schulman, how do you jump from exclusively to primarily? How do you take the congressional action and then really subvert it to a different view?
So let me say a couple things. One is, as I mentioned, this was a regulation, a Treasury regulation that's been in effect for many years. And so, at least speaking on behalf of myself, and I think I know how long Mr. Miller was there, this was in place when we got there. I don't necessarily disagree with you that this is, as I told Senator Wyden, this is a place that Congress should look, because from where I sit, the IRS is given a very, very, very difficult task of trying to go in and figure out there's enough political, you can do some political activity, but you can't do too much. And the confusion and breakdown that you saw happen in the Cincinnati office is inexcusable. But I would also posit, this is my belief, that part of it was because of the very difficult task given to these people.
Well, then it's a task that we should clearly correct if you can't do it. I mean, I envision exclusive to mean exclusive, not primarily. You know, I have a copy of an August 2012 op-ed by Carl Rove, which I asked unanimous consent to be included in the record. In this, Mr. Rove writes, this is quote, roughly 111 million of Mr. Obama's ad blitz was paid for by his campaign. Outside groups chipped in just over 20 million. The Romney campaign spent only 42 million over the same period in response, with 107.4 million more in ads attacking Mr. Obama's policies or boosting Mr. Romney coming from outside groups, with Crossroads GPS, a group, meaning him, Mr. Rove, I helped found, providing over half. Now, I don't mean to single him out as the only bad actor here, because there are many represented in the entire political spectrum, but this is the nature of the abuse. There is a reason that you seek a 501c4 status, because you can hide your donors, and you also have a tax advantage. Otherwise, you don't need to seek the 501c4 advantage. So the reason that people come forth with it, you know, I'd like to see what does it cost the American taxpayers in the granting of all of these 501c4s when they are not being used for social welfare, but they are being used, in essence, for political advocacy. Final question to the IG. Mr. Inspector General, did Chairman Issa sent a letter on August 3rd of 2012 to all of the Inspector Generals, reminding them that under the Inspector General's Act, it requires IGs to report particularly flagrant problems to Congress through the agency head within 7 days via what has become known as a 7-day letter. Did you receive that letter? And if so, did you respond to inform Chairman Issa of your investigation into the IRS?
Senator, we did receive the letter, and Chairman Issa's committee was the first to actually contact us regarding this matter. And so through the course of engaging in the review, on occasion, we have had communications with his staff.
In 2012?
And since then, yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think we all will agree that we cannot allow, permit, tolerate targeting by political views, and that we need to make sure that the process is clear to hold those accountable who violated that, but also to make sure this doesn't happen again. Having said that, I just want to concur with many of my colleagues on the interpretation of the law. The regulation, Mr. George, that you were relying on was issued in 1958, if I am correct in the year. I know it's been issued a long time ago, where you said not their primary activity, interpreting what is exclusively engaged in promotion of social welfare activities, which seems to be hard to understand. 1958, the political parameters were totally different than they are today. And I understand whose responsibility it is to change regulations, but it seems to me that this is an area that needs to be dealt with. I want to get further clarification on page 8 of your report, where you have a pie chart that lists the 298 cases that were pulled out for additional scrutiny. You identify 72 with the name Tea Party in it, if I'm reading the chart correctly, 11 with 912, and 13 with Patriots, and then 202 others. Can you give us further clarification with those, what makes up those 202?
Senator, we were not in a position to do so because in many instances, we were only reviewing the names of the organizations. And so certain names were so generic that we were unable to determine whether or not they had a particular point of view or what have you, or whether or not the IRS was using the policy positions that those groups held as a determinant for the special handling. But in other instances, when the name Tea Party was used, it was quite obvious, or if the name the Patriot was used, or if 20, or if of 11, 9, 12 rather was used.
What was the standard for the selection of those 202? Were you able to determine that?
That all of the 202 were reviewed to determine whether or not significant campaign intervention was engaged in.
But if I understand correctly, the 90-some were because of the name of the organization.
Correct.
The other 202, why were they selected?
According to our review, it was to determine whether significant campaign intervention had occurred by those organizations.
I understand that, but what basis was used to single out those 202?
I'm going to defer to actually Mr. Miller.
Mr. Miller, do you know what basis was used for that 202?
I don't. What I believe, Senator, is what's in the report, which is while the term Tea Party was used, more cases were being pulled in where folks saw evidence of political activity. They put those cases in. Those would include any case that came across their screening desk, sir.
But you don't know what standard they used to make a judgment that they were involved in political activities? Could have been the name of the organization. It could have been, I'm trying to figure out how these were selected. There has to be some rational, or at least some stated reason, or unless it's a random selection. Is it a random selection?
No, sir. I believe there was evidence of political activity that the screener believed was there, and therefore it was put in. I'll say this. It is my hope that when you all do your review, that some of these things will become more clear than they are in the report.
Well, I appreciate that. I'd be very interested as to how the IRS went about selecting all of the groups for review, in addition to the ones that were selected because of the use of the word Tea Party or 912 or Patriot, which is absolutely wrong.
But Senator, if I may, sir, that is part of the problem, because in many instances there was no indication at all in the case file why these particular cases were selected. And that was something that we identified as a problem in the way the IRS handled these matters.
And Mr. Miller, you don't know the standards that were used
I only
to
know
determine political activity.
I know what has been in the report, and I believe what was in the report, what's indicated is that the screeners were looking for evidence of political activity.
I think we need to have more information as to how these were selected. If there was an arbitrary selection of 90-some, it could well be there was an arbitrary selection of 300. And I think we need to know how that was determined. One last question, and that deals with your training dollars. One of the Inspector General's findings is that the staff was not adequately trained in order to meet the challenges. This is a complicated area. It involves some tough judgments, but it has to be done in some uniform way. Can you just share with us whether you have adequate resources in order to pursue the training at the IRS? Senator Portman and I, a few years back, worked on IRS reform, and I think both of us hoped that we would never be at a hearing like this after the reforms that were passed back then. One of our objectives was to make sure that that IRS was handled in a professional, nonpartisan way and had the resources it needed. Do you have the resources you need to have properly trained staff?
So first I'll say we did not train here well enough. There's no question about that. I think that's a finding of the IG report, and we believe that's the case as well. More generally, we are down $1 billion over the last couple of years, the IRS is, and that's caused us to cut training fairly drastically. We have, in this area, we have maybe 140 of our folks that do this sort of work, both in Cincinnati and reporting to Cincinnati through some other offices, which has been somewhat of a confusion I've seen out there. But we have 70,000 applications that come through. Do we have the resources to get the job done? I don't believe that we do at this point.
Thank you very much. Senator Brown, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you to the witnesses, and I agree with everyone here that's made this statement with some tone of anger in many cases that IRS should never go after anyone, should never single out anyone because of their political philosophy or their political affiliation, period. That's the most important thing. It is, however, I believe, not worthy of public trust to maintain the current troubles are the result of the entire fault of freelancing low-level employees, or they're asleep at the switch managers. It's pretty clear that it comes from a leadership vacuum that's persisted for too long, far too long in this particular area of tax law. The failure of the IRS for 5 decades to define what constitutes political activity. You know the statute. It's clear that 501c4s, available organizations that are operated, quote, exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. Back in 1959, And since we've not seen change to that, the gray area that exists today was created by the Treasury when they issued regulations and defined an organization operating exclusively as an organization primarily engaged in promoting social welfare. So explain that to me. I know you've talked about that in this hearing already, but what does the term primarily for social welfare mean? The IRS has not made that clear when the statute says exclusively, and that's really at the root of so many of these problems, Mr. Miller.
So I think, Senator, that you've mentioned this, and we've talked about this. We've had 50 years of this regulation in place. Organizations are operating within this framework. It is only recently with the flow of political dollars that has been called into question about whether this is the appropriate way to regulate these organizations. We have not done a good job, I think, of putting out guidance on even how to figure out what primarily means. Yes, you look at the activities of the organization. Yes, you look at the dollars of the organizations and the expenses of the organizations. But we've not been crisp on that either, and that's what our folks were faced with as well. So
no, the issue is how long do we wait? I mean, much of that is your predecessors, but we've had 3 years since Citizens United. We'd have 2 federal elections, tens of millions of dollars, state after state after state has been spent by 501c4s. How long do we wait until the IRS from Washington, not blaming it on Cincinnati, but from Washington, how long do we wait?
That's a question that you'll have to ask my successor, sir.
Mr. Schulman, let me ask you, what if any state steps were taken to define a test for primarily promoting social welfare? Where's that line? Were steps taken to establish a clearer definition of political activity?
I think the Inspector General stated this, that the Treasury Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy has authority to make tax policy. I actually don't think it's fair to blame the IRS for not fixing that. I think the IRS can give input, but this is actually something that if Congress decides it should be changed, Congress should either clarify or it should be done in regulation.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's clear that there are liberal groups and conservative groups that both follow the law, follow the regulations as they exist today. But there was only one group that was targeted. And you all can get here and say that there wasn't political targeting, but it just doesn't comport with the facts. Maybe it wasn't you, but somebody was. And I think one of the purposes of this hearing is to find out who was targeting conservative groups. Otherwise, you can't explain the fact that you had all these conservative, whether it was Patriot or Tea Party or 912 in their name, selected for extra scrutiny. You had no evidence that there were groups with progressive or names like that were similarly targeted. I mean, I think it's just, let's put this issue to rest. There's political targeting here. I don't think there's any way you can deny that. I'm interested in knowing, Mr. Miller and Mr. Schulman, if either of you were aware that Ms. Lerner was going to plant that question and try and get ahead of the news cycle by disclosing this prior to the release of the IG report.
I think I mentioned that I did know, yes.
Okay, and were there any discussions, the reporting is that the White House was aware, the White House counsel's office was aware on April 24th of this information. Were there any discussions with the White House about Ms. Lerner's intention to drop this bomb at the ABA conference?
I had no conversations with the White House, sir.
Are you aware of anybody else that did?
I am not aware of that.
There's also been reporting that Deputy Secretary Neil Wolin and Treasury General Counsel were made aware of the IRS or the IG report looking into the targeting of groups last June. Did you have any discussions with Treasury around that time?
That's a question to me, sir?
You or Mr. Schulman? I guess you'd probably be the...
I was deputy at that point, but no, I did not have any conversations at that time.
Mr. Schulman?
I don't remember having any conversations with the Treasury Department.
Okay, so there are no discussions. Are you aware of anybody that had discussions with the Treasury Department? The Treasury Department became aware of this information way back last June. None of that was, there were no discussions between the IRS and the Treasury that you're aware of.
Let me clarify. I think everybody knew that it was very difficult to administer the C4 laws. And so I don't have any memory of it, but there very well could have been conversations about policy, the policy matters that members of this committee have talked about. Should the primary purpose test be changed? At least standing for me, there were no conversations that I had with the Treasury Department about the matters in the report relating to inappropriate criteria, all the things that were in the news.
And that's the answer that I was giving, sir, just to be clear.
Okay. Now, Mr. Schulman, you testified in front of the House in March of last year that there was no targeting. You became aware of that in May. Don't you think that you should have had an obligation to clarify or to correct that statement that you'd made in front of the House committee?
In the spring, when I found out about a list that was being used to help place these applications into the determinations unit, what I knew was there was a list. I did know that Tea Party was on it. I didn't know what else was on the list. I had a partial set of facts, and I knew that the Inspector General was going to be looking into it, and I knew that it was being stopped. And sitting there then, and sitting here today, I think I made the right decision, which is to let the Inspector General get to the bottom of it, chase down all the facts, and then make his findings public.
Let me ask if I could, Mr. George, you mentioned earlier that disclosure of confidential information would be a violation of law?
It is, but whether it is administrative or criminal is the issue. But yes, it could be a violation of the law, specifically Title 26, Section 6103, and/or the Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998.
And so the reporting about the giving of this information to ProPublica, release of confidential information, it could very well be a violation of law.
It could be. It could have been, rather, I should say.
And let me just ask all of you, because there was a statement made over the weekend by somebody from the White House that the law would be irrelevant. Do you believe that the law is irrelevant, or is it relevant to this?
I believe the law is always relevant, sir.
Right. Gentlemen?
I'm not sorry. I'm sure I understand your question.
Well, there was a statement made over the weekend that whether the laws were broken was irrelevant. I'm just asking, do you believe that the laws are relevant in this case?
I mean, I guess I would agree with
I think the answer-
Inspector General that people should not break the law.
The answer would be yes. Well, Mr. Chairman, I just think there are a couple issues here. One is the targeting issue, and clearly that has, to me, a lot of political overtones. The other one is if there's information that was disclosed, that would be a violation of law. It's a very serious matter. But I think the American people believe that this is a very serious matter for both those reasons. They believe that the laws ought to be followed, and I think they also believe that they ought to have an IRS that competently conducts its business in an objective, fair, and transparent way. And those are all things that are missing in the equation. And so I hope that we continue to get more facts out about this and that the corrective actions are taken. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Burr.
Mr. Schulman, who briefed you?
Who briefed me on what, Senator?
Who briefed you on the investigation?
On the investigation?
Yes, sir.
The first I heard, to the best of my recollection of the investigation, was Mr. Miller telling me that there was the existence of the BOLO list, and it was something that the Inspector General was going to look into.
Mr. George, did you brief Mr. Miller, or did any of your investigative team brief Mr. Miller in May of 2012?
It was on May 30th, Senator, 2012, where at a monthly briefing, which we regularly hold with both the commissioner and his chief deputies, that we first raised this as an issue. Obviously, it was at the outset of the investigation.
Now, Mr. Miller says he's not aware of the practice that was going on in the EO. Did you brief him on the scope of the investigation?
I don't believe we went into the detail which may have laid out the scope, Senator, but we certainly alerted them to the fact that we were conducting this audit. I want to make sure I'm clear. I may have misused the word investigation. It was an audit that we were engaging in.
Now, Neil Woolen, as my colleague just pointed out, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, was briefed in June of 2012. I've just heard two people at the table say they didn't brief him. Mr. George, did you brief or did part of your investigative team brief Neil Woolen, the Deputy Secretary of Treasury?
Senator, I personally, again, brought to Deputy Secretary Woolen's attention the fact that we were engaging in this audit. And
did that briefing cover the details of the scope of your investigation?
It did not, sir. It was other than to describe the nature of the audit, and that was the extent of it, because there were other matters that we were discussing.
Now, Mr. George, your investigation states that the council was briefed in August of 2011 of the practice at the EO. Was that the IRS counsel, or was it the Treasury General Counsel?
Actually, sir, it was in June 4th of 2012. I, again, in terms of a regular setting that I have with meeting, I should say, that I have with the General Counsel of the Department of the Treasury.
Now, I know you're talking about your briefing.
Yes.
I'm talking about a reference in your report that the council was briefed by somebody. I take for granted it was somebody within the EO. This was an exchange on the practice that was going on, that the council at the IRS was knowledgeable in 2011. Am I correct?
Sir, it was just pointed out to me that attorneys within the Office of Chief Counsel within the IRS were briefed on this
So the
matter.
Chief Counsel of the IRS understood what the practice was that was going on within the EO of these applications, correct?
I was not at that set briefing, sir, but I don't know the extent to which they received information.
Well, here again, this was before your investigation started, but your investigation concluded that the General Counsel of the IRS knew of the practices. They had been discussed within the attorneys of the Internal Revenue Service.
It's the Office of Chief Counsel, and that they were provided a briefing.
So is it normal for the Chief Counsel's office of an agency not to have any conversations with the commissioner or the deputy?
I have no idea of the practices.
Now, let me just turn to both of you. Mr. Miller, you said, are you testifying that the IRS counsel never talked to you about this?
No, sir. I haven't been asked that question, and I don't. If we could step back for a moment, sir. And I think, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think that the timeline that you're referring to when it talks about chief counsel, it's talking about the office of chief counsel, not necessarily the chief counsel, and that could have been anyone in that chain.
So you've got attorneys that are involved in a discussion about the practice that the EO is conducting on how they process applications, C4 applications, and that would not have been something that was raised to the level of commissioner?
Well, let me start by saying I didn't know that until I read the report. So, and I don't know anything about that meeting, sir. That's something that you guys should take a look at.
Mr. Schulman, are you testifying today that the council never discussed this matter with you?
I mean, if you're asking the question, did anyone from the chief counsel's office come and tell me about meetings they were having with the exempt organization function, I have no memory of anyone doing that.
Mr. Chairman, let me suggest that we need to get the Chief Counsel, William Wilkins, in to testify, see if the counsel's office signed off on this practice. I think that's absolutely crucial. Now, Mr. Miller, let me just ask you, has this practice stopped?
What practice, sir?
The practice of how they process consideration of these applications. Keywords, conservative, Tea Party, Patriot.
I believe that did happen. The names stopped when it when Lois Lerner first learned of it. The second listing, by the way, if you take a look at that in the Treasury Inspector General's report, is still problematic because it talks about policy positions, but it actually is not particularly partisan in how it talks about policy positions.
So it was partisan. It was partisan before, though.
Yes, it absolutely was.
Let me just point out for the record that the target for approval within the IRS of these applications is 120 days. There are currently some applications that are over 1,200 days without action. So let me ask you, has this practice stopped? And if it has, What's the date that it stopped? If it
So-
stopped, it seems like these applications would have been processed by now.
So let's break this up a little bit, Senator, and let me see if I can answer your question. The process I was talking about was the selection process. That's been modified. We've also worked on getting people the technical knowledge they need to work these cases. Some of these cases are difficult cases. They should not have taken as long as they have, but they still need some development, and those cases are being worked.
Is there any case, any application that you don't think could be processed in 1,200 days?
I would hope that they could, but there are cases that go into appeals, there are cases that go to court, there are all sorts of cases. These are difficult cases. There's no doubt that some part of that 1,200 was when they were languishing before May of 2012. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Isaacson, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last night, I did a monthly telephone town hall meeting, which I do every month, back to my state. During the course of an hour, they had up to 2,500 people on the call. During the course of the hour, I handled 21 questions, and I always make notes when I'm answering the phone, so the next day I can review things that I didn't know the answer to or whatever. My 10th call last night was from a person named Sid, and his statement was very simple. Given what has happened, apparently, at the IRS, I've lost confidence in the United States of America. That was a constituent comment. That was not a reactionary comment, but he went on to further say, if the agency that collects taxes from me is able to target, as they did in the qualification for tax-free status, what's to keep them from using the tax system to target me for other things? So the reason this is an important hearing, the reason it's an important audit, and the reason we do need to have an important investigation is if for no other reason to restore the confidence of the United States of America in the Internal Revenue Service. So I want that understood. That's my concern, and that came to me from a constituent last night who said it far better than I could possibly say it. Now, Mr. George, I want to make sure you said that I understand what you said correctly. I believe that Ms. Lerner was in charge of the approval of this department during 2011. Is that correct?
That's yes, sir.
I thought I heard you say that the Cincinnati office was ordered to change their criteria by the director, and that following that order to change it, they changed it back.
That is correct, sir.
Do you know who changed it back? Do you know who initiated the change back? Is there anybody or person or trail, or did it just all of a sudden appear to be a criteria that was changed back to?
We have not found any evidence as to the identification of the person who ordered the reversion of the policy.
That's my point, and I'm following up on Senator Burr's question and your statement. You did an audit. You did not do an investigation.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And audits are developed to find if there's a possibility of wrongdoing or if there isn't. Is that not correct?
Among other things, it also looks at the systemic problems that may exist within a program.
To date, there has been no internal investigation at IRS. Is that correct?
That I'm not aware of, sir. I would defer to Mr. Miller.
We took a look in the March timeframe to take a look at what was happening in the cases. That was when I was reported to me in May that there were issues. This sort of thing would be done by TIGDA, and we stood and worked with TIGDA on this.
All right, then let me ask both you and Mr. Schulman quite the same question. You are now past commissioners of the IRS, correct? There's going to be a new commissioner, correct? Let's assume that commissioner is going to make a phone call before he or she accepts the appointment and ask for your advice as to what to do. Regarding this issue, what would your advice be to the next commissioner of the IRS? Mr. Miller?
I would agree with your opening statement, sir. I mean, we have, and it breaks my heart because I've spent 25 years trying to protect the service. The service, right now, the perception is that there's an issue, and that new commissioner needs to attack it. He needs to, or she needs to, take a hard look, make some changes, put in place some safeguards that are very obvious in terms of their transparency, what the process is, how we're going to do things, and regain the belief of the American people that the IRS is and remains nonpartisan.
Mr.
Schulman. So the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service has multiple things to deal with: filing season, technology. Last year, it was the fiscal cliff, offshore issues. And I think the challenge for the next commissioner is, frankly, what you talked about, that, this whole episode has clearly put a blemish on the agency. It's cast a shadow over all of the good work that the men and women do every day. I think what the next commissioner needs to do is try to rebuild the faith that people have in the impartiality and fairness of the agency without losing sight of, this is a small sliver, an important one, of what the agency does, and not have it overwhelm him so problems emerge elsewhere.
Well, my hope was that the answer would have been that whomever the next commissioner is, he or she, should immediately request an investigation of the findings of the audit to determine if there were violations, if there were, who authorized them, and if they were authorized, who actually carried them out. Because to me, the one thing that we have never gotten to at the bottom of this is what the chairman referred to at the beginning of the hearing, is who, what, where, and when. And when we do that, only when those answers to that question take place, can you begin the process of restoring the confidence of the American people in the Internal Revenue Service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I think Senator Cornyn's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and Senator Hatch for convening this hearing in a strong bipartisan way and in accordance with the finest traditions of the Senate. This is a very important issue, as we all know, and without regard to party affiliation or stripe or ideology, if we can't trust the IRS to perform its functions impartially in accordance with the rule of law, the confidence in the American people will be shaken to its very core. So this is very important, and I want to say thank you for that. Mr. Miller and Mr. Schulman, as you know, in 2011 and 2012, I began to receive complaints from my constituents in Houston, Texas, Waco, and San Antonio from organizations like the King Street Patriots, True the Vote, the San Antonio Tea Party, and the Waco Tea Party, asking me to assist them to inquire why the IRS was taking a particularly aggressive posture with regard to their applications for tax-exempt status. And I share Senator Hatch's and others' comments and concerns about the denials that have occurred over the course of time that any targeting was taking place, when we now know that targeting was in fact taking place. Mr. Miller, you started your testimony by apologizing, and Mr. Schulman, I wonder if you have any words of apology for my constituents and others who feel like the public trust has been violated by the IRS.
I'm deeply, deeply saddened by this whole set of events. I've read the IG's report, and I very much regret that it happened and that it happened on my watch.
Is that an apology?
To your constituents, I don't know the details of your constituents. I don't know what happened to them. I didn't, look at particular constituent and taxpayer matters. I mean, as a general principle, as the IRS commissioner, I didn't touch individual cases, and I certainly didn't touch cases that involved political activity. So if I knew the details of it, I could give you, an answer.
So it's not your responsibility?
The
buck doesn't stop with you?
I certainly am not personally responsible for creating a list that had inappropriate criteria on it. And what I know, with the full facts that are out, is from the Inspector General's report, which doesn't say that I'm responsible for that. With that said, this happened on my watch, and I very much regret that it happened on my watch.
Well, I don't think that qualifies as an apology. It qualifies as an expression of regret, which I think is well-deserved. But I have, beyond just the question about the particular activities here that the Inspector General has discovered and which we are all now becoming acquainted with,
I had a question, Mr. Schulman, about what you talked about earlier in your testimony as the core function of the IRS. And when I think about the core function of the IRS, it is to collect the revenue that the federal government needs in order to function. But it seems like over the years that the Congress has given the IRS additional responsibilities, for example, to police political activity and speech, and now to implement Obamacare. I believe you mentioned there are some 90,000 employees in the IRS. Would you share my concerns that the IRS has deviated from its core function and should be reformed to focus on that core function and perhaps not be given these other additional responsibilities until it can get its house in order?
I guess what I would say is the IRS is tasked with the responsibility of administering the nation's tax laws. And over the years, the nation's tax laws have been used for more and more things. And so I think I defer to Congress to decide what it wants to use the tax code for, and whether it wants the IRS to do all of the functions in the tax code. But as long as the IRS is given that responsibility, I think the obligation of the agency is to do it to the best of its ability.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time is almost over, but I would just say I agree with your comments that you started out with in saying that if we need a clarion call to Congress that we've asked the IRS to do much more than its core function and now to get involved in things like policing political activity and speech and now implementing Obamacare, that it's not all that surprising that these kind of problems have arisen in addition to given the discretion that mid and low-level individuals have and the lack of proper management practices. So I think this is a great opportunity not only for us to get to the bottom of what happened here, but also to address tax reform in a way that returns the IRS to their core function and gets them out of policing political speech and other activities. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. I think you're next, Senator Thune. That's my understanding.
He already did.
Oh, you gave, I'm sorry, I was out when you spoke. Portman, Senator Portman, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, I also had a teletown hall meeting last night. My colleague from Georgia talked about it. We had about 25,000 people on at any one time. And the questions were coming in from Republicans, from Democrats, from independents, all saying the same thing, which was outrage. And the outrage being expressed was that at the very least, the IRS ought to have an even-handed and a fair administration of our tax laws, given the power of the agency. Mr. Miller, in response to concerns expressed by grassroots organizations around Ohio, as you know, Senator Hatch and I, joined by 8 of our colleagues, sent a letter to the IRS on March 14th, 2012. You responded to that letter. And I just want to tell you why I joined Senator Hatch on this letter. The Portage County Tea Party of Ohio was asked to print out every posting it had ever made on its Facebook page and to turn over the names of every person who had ever spoken at a meeting. I thought that was really odd. The Ohio Liberty Township Tea Party was hit with 94 exhaustive follow-up questions and demands for information in March of 2011 in response to their January application. Demands included resumes of all past and present employees, all social media posts. One question actually asked specifically about any connection with an individual who doesn't live in that county, actually lives in my home county, and was involved in another Tea Party. So they were trying to find out about an individual that had no connection with that Tea Party. Kind of scary. The Ohio Liberty Coalition was hit with similar questions, concerns. Its application was delayed by over 2 years. The Shelby County Liberty Group sent me this letter they got from the IRS, and it is, as Mr. George has talked about earlier, inappropriate, irrelevant questions, and they were also given 3 weeks, 21 days to respond. These are individuals who were asked to come up with tons of information in a short period of time, much of which was difficult for them to compile. So they contacted me. For instance, they want to know the names of every person in the organization, the amount of time they spend at particular events. They want to know detailed contents of speeches, forums, names of speakers, panels, so on and so forth. So that's why we wrote the letter. And our letter asked for the IRS to give us, quote, assurance that this recent string of inquiries is consistent with the IRS's treatment of tax-exempt organizations across the political spectrum. So the letter was very specific. There was no question what we were asking. The letter specifically asked, when and on what basis does the IRS require a 501c4 applicant to make disclosures beyond the standard information, and what objective criteria are used to identify applications for greater scrutiny? These questions go to the heart of political allegations that we were hearing about. So let me ask you, Mr. Miller, did you receive and read that letter on March 14th?
I don't know when I read it. At some point.
Did you receive that letter and read it?
At some point, yes, sir.
Did you think the allegations described in the letter, what we called the serious implications of discriminatory enforcement, were alarming?
I was aware already of the problems that were occurring in those letters, and I was in agreement that they seemed over.
You were aware before the March 14th letter this was occurring?
In the same time frame, sir.
I didn't realize that. So you knew before the March 14th letter that these serious allegations were out there.
Well, sir,
and you testified on or about March 23rd.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought there were things in the newspapers as well.
You testified that on or about March 23rd, 9 days after receiving our letter, that you asked Nancy Marks, who's the senior technical advisor for tax-exempt and government entities, to, quote, lead a team and take a look what was going on based on these allegations. Is that correct?
I did.
And you testified that Nancy Marks reported back to you on May 3rd with the revelation that political criteria had in fact been used to target certain 501c4 applicants. In fact, you said today that that 2012 briefing included much of what is outlined in the IG report by Mr. George. So for 6 weeks, from March 23rd, when you sent your team down to Cincinnati to find out what was going on, to May 3rd, you didn't bother to ask for any kind of interim report or updates from the team that you tasked with investigating these serious allegations?
No, sir. I don't believe I did.
So you sent a team off, and for 6 weeks, you didn't ask them what was going on? Never heard from them?
I don't recollect that I did that one way or another, sir. I mean, the implication is that this was a pretty short time frame, sir.
6 weeks. So you're finding out about these very serious allegations, you're sending the team out, and for 6 weeks you never hear back from them, never have the curiosity to ask them what's going on.
The allegations, sir, we had handled. We had looked at those letters. They seemed overbroad to us. We gave people more time. We pulled back the donor list requests, and by the way, the donor
well, no,
list requests
you hadn't acted yet. This was still going on during this period. I'm talking about between March 23rd and May 3rd.
So there's two pieces here, sir. One is what I found out on May 3rd. The letters we acted on immediately. We tried to get people more time, and I think if you talk to your folks, that's going to be what they're going to say.
So if you didn't even bother to hear back from them for 6 weeks, you responded to our letter on April 26th, and you did not bother to ask them if anything was wrong before you chose to respond to our allegations. In other words, on March 26th, with assurances that nothing was wrong to us, you did not even wait to hear back from this team that was investigating these allegations. You chose to respond without the information.
No, I responded to the questions that were asked, and they were all about the donor list, and they were responded to correctly and truthfully.
No, remember, this is the letter I talked about earlier where we asked specifically about whether there was political targeting. It was very clear what we were asking about. You sent a team out to go investigate it. The team takes 6 weeks. You respond to us on April 26th, which was a week before you apparently heard back from them. And you didn't bother to get the report from them before you responded to us. Is that accurate?
I don't know whether I did, whether I purposely did that or not. I don't think I did, sir. Bottom line is, I answered the questions I thought were being asked. I answered them truthfully, sir.
So you didn't bother to check with the team investigating these charges before assuring me, Senator Hatch, and others in your April 26th letter that the IRS applies greater scrutiny to 501c4 applications based on only, you said, individualized consideration, whether issues remain. In other words, no political criteria whatsoever. Let me ask you this.
Senator,
we've learned today that the IG report says that the Office of Chief Counsel was aware of political targeting as early as August 2011. Did you consult the Chief Counsel in the course of responding to Mr. Hatch's and my letter?
5-second
March
answer.
14th letter.
I don't know that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Chairman.
Next on the list is Senator Toomey. I might say that there's a vote going on, and Senator Hatch is going over to vote to come right back. I plan to have another round of questions afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, a quick point. A number of my colleagues have seemed to be upset about the fact that some Americans choose to exercise their First Amendment rights anonymously. I would remind us all that perhaps one of the most important and influential works of political advocacy ever done in the history of the Republic were the Federalist Papers, which were written anonymously under pseudonyms. I'd also point out that whatever one thinks of how the Treasury rule implementing the C4 standards has been developed over the decades, how it's written, has absolutely nothing to do with the IRS decision to use ideology as a basis for imposing unnecessary, inappropriate, and extra screening on people seeking 501c4 status and other matters. Let me ask Mr. Miller, I just want to be very clear and follow up on the line of questioning from Senator Isaacson. So we're sitting here in May of 2013. At this point, do you know who it is that initiated the policy of establishing these ideological criteria for creating this additional level of screening for applicants for C4 status?
I think, I mean, it happened twice. The second time it happened, I don't believe there's clarity on that. The first time, I think there's more clarity on that.
So who was it? What is the name of the person who did that?
I can give you the name. I'll be glad to respond to that, but I don't know off the top of
I think that's important that we understand who did that, that we know exactly who did. Who ordered that it be stopped?